So this is the Janet Watson meeting, Future of Contaminated Land Risk Assessment Stakeholder Perspectives. This is the new group which has just been formed for the Geological Society. We had the launch event back in March this year. We ran a logo competition where we asked for entries to design the new logo. And this is the winning logo by Sarah Clement Dawson, who's a Senior Contaminated Land Officer at Durham Council. So just to present the new logo, which you'll see on everything going forwards from now on. As we go through the sessions today, we'll introduce what's going on. However, there will be the first 3 sessions before the first coffee break at 11 o'clock. And we're not going to do questions after each individual talk. We're going to save them for intervals altogether. So the first lot of questions will be at 11 o'clock just before the coffee break. So please do not ask questions after each one. We'll invite all the speakers back up and then we can ask questions then. The first speaker is going to be Clair Dickinson, speaking about risk assessment. So could I invite Claire up to the stage?
Thank you very much. Now, I've got to remember to stand here, not walk around as I usually do. Thank you very much for inviting me. Most conferences seek to show knowledge and advantages in a particular field of expertise. Today, we're going to be talking about risk assessment. And this conference is no exception to many others. The programme looks fantastic. But actually, in my career, I spent a lot of my time talking about what I don't know, talking about the uncertainties in those geological and environmental decisions that I have had to make. So, a little bit about me. I'm Clair Dickinson. I'm an independent consultant. I have spent many years looking at risks in the ground. What I want to say at this time, in line with what I'm going to talk about today, is what you perhaps don't know is I'm not actually a quantitative risk assessor. But being a contaminated land specialist, risk assessment is at the heart of all those decisions that I'm involved making. It's a big topic, risk assessment. Even what you don't know about it would take more than the 20 minutes that I have. So what I'm going to want to do today is just take a little snapshot at some of those issues. So I'm going to talk about things that you're probably all familiar with. I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics. And then I'm going to have a quick zip across and look at how good the science is, because the science underpins what we do. I also want to talk a little bit about how times are changing and what impact that might have on our risk assessments. And then I shall offer you a few concluding thoughts, which I hope this presentation is going to help stimulate one of the panels that we're going to have later on. So I want to set some context to start with. Let's get us all on familiar ground. You're all used to looking at government policies. You know that contaminated land is risk-based in the UK. The point I really wanted to draw out here is that when we are sitting there doing our risk assessments, do we actually think about the impact that we're doing in terms of society and particularly individuals? I think it is interesting when we think about Part 2A that to a certain extent was probably thought about in terms of companies that caused the pollution being caught up by that legislation, but actually quite a lot of individuals have been. And one of those things is, as a house owner, how would I feel if I was one of those houses that is on the Stonegate housing estate, which has just recently reached its conclusion as part of the Part 2A planning appeal, taking 10 years from the initial report to actually reaching closure. So it has real impact what we do on real people. So I lament, like many of you, I'm sure, on the demise of the Environment Agency and DEFRA sections of our websites. We are now reduced to www.gov.uk. However, they do have some guidance, and I thought it was quite interesting that even for a layperson, they're making very clear that risk assessment involves uncertainties. Assessing risks means you can estimate what might happen, how bad it might be, and use this knowledge to help make decisions. You must reduce uncertainties where you can clearly explain the ones that remain. So it goes on to say You may find it difficult to get exact measurements of contamination, know how widespread it is, predict what harm it may cause for reasons including a lack of scientific information, varying contaminant levels, possible effects of contamination vary in different circumstances. We have different end uses. The difficulty of predicting when and how substances might cause harm to people or animals or the environment. Look round the room. We're all individuals. We all have different predispositions to being harmed by substances, biological hazards, etc. We've all heard about the woman that's lived to 100 and smoked every day since the age of 13. What can I say? So I thought we'd get some familiar terms out the way. The next speech is actually going to be on the conceptual model. So I don't want to get too involved here on hazard assessment and looking at that modelling. But I do want to touch on hazard identification, and I am going to talk a little bit about risk estimation and risk evaluation. So let's look at some hazard identification, data uncertainties. This is based on my experience. You can go to the Contaminated Land Expert Panel part of the Clair website and download their thoughts on uncertainties. But these are common pitfalls that I find almost all the time. So I'm quite often asked, I'm given a set of laboratory results, is this site contaminated? I don't know. And these are just some of the reasons why I might not know. So, classic one that I get at the moment, desk studies. How often do I see a desk study come across my desk, which perhaps, as is in the example here, has had previous development on it? It was bombed during the Second World War. It then had prefabs on it. It was then redeveloped again. Where's the risk of asbestos? It was completely absent. And yet, when they got in to do the investigation, I wonder what they found. They found asbestos. So getting that information on what we should be actually looking for is an important part of it. We're often, at early stages investigations, limited by access. And we all know that buildings and services, they all get in the way and they limit where we can get. But sometimes it means that you've actually chosen equipment that might limit what you can get out of it. And obviously window samples are quite small, really. And the result of that is when you go to fill up your tub, you quite often end up sampling across different strata, which makes assessing the contaminant properties of that soil quite difficult. Poor sampling practice. I know Hazel's here today, Hazel Davidson, and one of her classic examples of poor sampling, asbestos. Asbestos-containing materials, they're usually in fragments, aren't they? If you have a jar and it's only that big and you're sampling, what do you tend to do? You exclude those big bits, don't you? What might they contain? And there are other things like sampling depth. You know, the way we do our analysis, you know, is that what we're then going to be able to compare it against? And I mean, I'm seeing less now, but there was a time when, you know, assessing anything was difficult because the detection limits or quantification limits just weren't right. Another thing, can I rely on this laboratory result? That's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because it's a number, it's written in black and white. I think I might want to believe that that is correct, isn't it? But do you know what they were measuring? Different methods give different results. Do you know how the sample was prepared? Is the laboratory and the test method accredited? Does the laboratory take part in a proficiency scheme? And I just wanted to share with you the latest asbestos in soils results. This is from June of this year, and a number of laboratories take part. The HSL published the results and run the scheme. I personally found it slightly disconcerting that on this round, only 57.5% of the results were satisfactory. 35% were questionable. 7.5% were unsatisfactory. And we are making decisions. Now, in terms of risk assessment, we use other lines of evidence. But if you're looking at hazardous waste thresholds, it's an absolute number. This could seriously impact the bottom line. Or you could end up classifying your waste incorrectly. So obvious tips for minimising laboratory risks. You know, we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And sometimes it's difficult to know. We can check out laboratory credentials. We can discuss with them what we're wanting to achieve. But one of the best ways I found is putting blanks in. And on one occasion, some years ago, I was horrified to find that my office tap water was actually more oily than the site I'd been sampling from. I think things have probably moved on now, but it doesn't change the fact that laboratories do have problems, so don't be afraid to challenge the results. Another site I had, mercury turned up in this groundwater. I scratched my head, I went back, I Googled, I could not find any reason for this mercury to be there. So I went back to the laboratory and said, hey, you know, is this result real? It turned out they'd had a problem with a whole batch of samples, and it was me going back that triggered that look. I want to talk just briefly about handling data. As land quality professionals, we're asked to make decisions, aren't we, that are reliant on sampling and testing. We have a small sample here. We have another one over there. The actual volume of the sample that's tested is very small. We are never going to know the true mean concentration of a contaminant in a soil body. So what do we do about that? Well, actually, we start looking at other tools, and statistics is commonly used. And I know we've all find statistics, and I think when we think of statistics, this phrase comes up, lies, damn lies, and statistics. And as my former colleague used to say, it's all about the conceptual model, but I don't want to spend too much time on that because Judith will be. But I did just want to zip in and have a quick look at zoning. So one of the things is we have to try and work out what hazard this soil represents. And what I often see is that we mix things up. Our data soups are quite often grouped across different contaminant populations. And that becomes meaningless. Quite often, actually, even when you look at the data, it's quite possible just to work out which soil type it is just by looking at the contaminant fingerprint. It really does matter. I've also seen, I want to get to a particular answer. Let's keep taking the outliers out until I get an answer I like. Also, not necessarily statistically valid. And why does this matter? Well, I wanted to just come back to this Woolen Hole planning appeal briefly. The remediation notice was squashed. They didn't ever reach agreement on what SPOSH was in terms of BAP. There's quite a lot of discussion on it, which you can read on the report that is published online. But one of the key points that came out on this is that the Secretary of State, in writing her decision, said, finds that Walsall did not undertake a risk assessment based on sound science, which would allow it to conclude that the entirety of zones 4 and 7 represented SPOSH, and that Walsall unreasonably identified land to which the notice relates as contaminated land. There were shortcomings in the statistical analysis of data sets, with significant degree of uncertainty as whether too high values for zone 7 represented a genuine risk or were outliers. And this is where it gets really important that you think about how the statistics fit, and that works with your zoning. And all zoning is looking at whether a relationship between your site history and your end use. So in this case, they were looking at the gardens. It was gardens placed on a former gasworks site. The gasworks site, when it had been demolished, had ended up with a lot of made ground spread across the site. There was a lot of variability between individual sampling points. But actually, the question came down into zone 7 was the fact that there was some site history in relation to these two hotspots, which were then lumped in a larger zone, which meant that it might not have been valid. And that was part of the reason this was overturned. So it does matter. So let's look at the science, shall we? We all need this, don't we? We're 70% water. There's a recommendation that I should be drinking 2 litres of this a day. I wash in it. I drink it. I swim in it. I sit in a bath for a long time. I inhale it through steam. It's really good stuff, isn't it? Well, like all substances, this can kill. In fact, in the news only last year, a woman died from drinking water. It wasn't contaminated. It was just water, like you and I would drink. And why was that? It was because of the volume that was drunk in a short amount of time. She drank more than her body could cope with. 6 litres in 3 hours. The body couldn't cope with it. It killed her. And the question is, at what level is too much? And that is always a problem. How do we know? And it's usually quite difficult. So let's have a look at a contaminant that we know quite a lot about. Asbestos, our old friend. We know this causes fatalities. We don't need animal studies for this. We have the first medically recorded death from asbestos in 1924. We've known about this for a long time. We have high public awareness. People know. I mean, if you spoke to somebody in the street, they'd know about asbestos. And of course, there is really good documented occupational exposure. We have a really good understanding of what high levels and exposure of asbestos can do to you. But actually, despite all that we know about it, there's a lot that we don't know. We don't know what the background air concentration for asbestos are in the UK. We have no idea. We have some figures that from the World Health Organization from 1980. But in 2000, we banned asbestos. 1999, we banned final use of asbestos. So we don't actually know what's in our air. We don't know, when we've got so much in the soil, how much that will give rise to airborne fibre release. And in terms of risks from non-occupational exposure, when you're exposed to very low levels, again, we don't really understand the science. So then let's jump a different way. Let's look at an emerging contaminant. So here we have something that actually we have low awareness. Syria ran a day in the summer looking at contamination in tomorrow's world, and one of the workshops was on PFOS. Well, actually, the person running the workshop ended up not doing a discussion, but having a teaching session, because actually the level of awareness was so low. Public awareness here, it seems to be passing people by, but certainly that's not the case in other parts of the world. But the science here, we really don't understand. We know that it's potentially a problem. There is enough evidence that the EPA in the States have said that they can see that there's a relationship between PFOS and 6 particular diseases, but at what level is safe? And I think it's fascinating to see that we are talking in the UK about a drinking water level of 0.3 micrograms per litre, whereas the US EPA is talking about 17 nanograms per litre. There's a lot of work to do to understand the science. Going to a slightly different area. What about contaminated sediments? That's a whole area that I think has gone in the too difficult to do box. We don't have any published guidance in the UK, apart from the CFAS disposal levels. And there was a report posted in 2015 that cast doubt on the value of those figures. When I look at contaminated sediments, it feels like how we were as a contaminated land industry 30 years ago. We are beginning to see this change, that our drivers, the Water Framework Directive, we've done all the easy stuff. What is it? 27% of UK water bodies have achieved good water quality status. Done the easy stuff. We've now got to start tackling the tricky stuff. And that is going to be contaminated sediments. So I just want to have another sort of look at a slightly different angle. I've got some headlines here. So something else I'm quite interested in is we hear a lot about climate change at the moment. Trump, I believe, doesn't think it's happening. But regardless of what Trump believes, we are seeing extreme weather events. they are impacting contaminated land. And we can see that there are some real threats, not just from elsewhere in the world, but here. We've got eroding landfills. We've got floods that are lifting up those contaminated sediments and depositing them on land. Now, those sediments we might think are now all clean because, of course, we control our discharges, don't we? That's fine. But, of course, when we have extreme storm events, it releases the sediment that is contaminated below the clean layer. And what's in those sediments? All those nasties you thought you'd said goodbye to, like DDT. So, I'd like to ask you now, I'm going to do a straw poll, how many of you actually take extreme weather events or climate change into your risk assessments? Now, come on, you're not meant to look at each other and wonder, oh, I've got somebody. Now, that's really interesting. So, did you know, in 2010, in our frequently asked questions, it says, risks of contamination that are acceptable now might not be in the future. You need to factor climate change into your risk assessments. Interesting. 2010, 2017. 7 years. I have to confess, I didn't know that until, fairly recent times. But if you think about it, we need to be considering groundwater. If our colleagues and other professionals are looking at flood risk assessments that are predicting what's happening in 2030, what's happening in 2070, surely we should be taking these into account, because it might be it's mobilising contaminants that it wouldn't have done otherwise. It might be it's driving ahead of gas. It might be that it's causing erosion. It might mean that there's saltwater inundation, which mobilises metals in a different way from fresh water. This is something I think we need to be considering. And yet, like everything else, the guidance and the science on this is still evolving. So, to conclude, I've tried to show you in this opening address this morning just a few of the challenges that we're up against. But we are being asked to make decisions on probably a daily basis. Contaminated land risk assessments are based on known scientific principles, but they have inherent unknowns and uncertainties. Our decisions are a combination of those risk assessments and judgment. In my opinion, robust contaminated land decisions are about getting the basics right, using tools to assess uncertainty. They need to be based on existing government and good practice guidance. And one of the things that comes out of Will and Hall is the fact of the need to really follow that guidance. Another thing that came out of Will and Hall was the need for expert opinion. I'm not a quantitative risk assessment. When I need those skills, I go and find somebody with them to support me to do that sort of work. Similarly, a statistician, if necessary. But what I'm really interested in as a reviewer of reports is that those uncertainties are documented and that the implications with respect to the assessment are noted. Thank you very much for listening to me. I have some information about some of these things on a website that I've developed called www.geomatters.com, so you can go and find links to various bits of information should you wish to do so.
Thanks, Claire, that was really good. Our next speaker is Judith Nathaniel. If you'd like to come up, please.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Judith Nathaniel. I work for a company called Land Quality Management Limited. I've been working in the geotechnical and contaminated land industry for longer than I want to share with you. I started off working for Wimpey Laboratories, moved on to work for Delta Simons as a project manager, and I've been with Land Quality Management since about the year 2000. So today I'm going to talk about why the conceptual model is at the heart of contaminated land risk assessment, and the should be is to imply that I'm sure it doesn't apply to anybody who's here, but we all know we see reports where there aren't conceptual models or they're not as good as they should be. So I'm going to explain why the conceptual model is the central tool for contaminated land management, then talk about what should be in a conceptual model, looking at some examples that are good or perhaps less good. Then go back to the guidance. Always good to go back to the guidance, see what it says, see what it's asking us to do. Then move on to explain how the conceptual model actually drives the risk assessment, look at conceptual models at different stages of the risk assessment process, and then conclude by saying, in my view, the conceptual model isn't just an output that is at the end of our report. It's a tool we should be using throughout the process. Okay, starting with the conceptual model is a central tool for contaminated land management. As we know, we use it to synthesize information about the site history, the geology, where the contamination is, and if we do it early enough and we use it as a tool, the creation of the conceptual model can help us crystallize our understanding of what is going on the site, the 3D relationships. And we can use the conceptual model to answer the key questions that we are trying to answer, namely, have we got any significant pollutant linkages? And when we move on to remediation, have the pollutant linkages been broken? As I say, it's a tool. It's a tool partly for us, those of us who are creating them, to understand what is going on our site, and partly to communicate with other stakeholders. And it should be updated throughout the contaminated land process. So typically, a conceptual model will comprise one or more diagrams. Ideally, it should have some kind of plan view, some kind of cross-section, so we've got an idea of the 3D relationships in space, and then something to tell us what the pollutant linkages are. It might be a network diagram, might be a table. And then that little box at the bottom, uncertainties. Claire did me a great favour with her uncertainties, putting uncertainties square and central to the debate. There are a lot of uncertainties, and the conceptual model is a means to trap them and to explore them, as we will see. So I'm going to start by talking about what should be in a conceptual model. And I guess if you wanted to summarise this, it would be it's generally not just a table. But because I see so many conceptual models presented as just a table, I'm actually going to spend a few minutes just thinking about models from first principles. What are conceptual models outside our field? Geological models, the ground model that engineering geologists are so familiar with, and then bring it back to conceptual site models. Okay, so the International Association of Engineering Geology does have a commission on using engineering geological models, and they've got a working definition of what a model is: an approximation of reality created for the purpose of solving a problem. And if we were to just do conceptual model, take the words conceptual model, put it into Google, you would see pictures and diagrams. It doesn't matter what they are. Could be ecological, could be financial. What they are doing is showing relationships between whatever the key facts are in that particular domain. And some of them are pictorial, though not all. This is just a pictorial conceptual model of what happens in the realm of shale gas. And it enables me to draw out the point that a nice picture does enable you to have a bit of a debate. So we're all very familiar with the hydraulic fracturing is bad debate, and I would say that that's because the public sees massive, giant hydraulic fractures like that on these little schematics, and if anyone's got a drilling rig that can make hydraulic fractures that big, well, I'd be interested to know about it. But the point is, the pictorial conceptual model is showing us the main features of the process. Okay, moving on to geological models. Lots of us are geologists here. We're used to looking at a limited amount of field evidence and building up a picture of the geological history of an area, and then creating our geological model. We know it's a model. We know that those boundaries are not exactly where we show them on our map. It's where we think they probably are, and it gives us enough information. So we create a geological model showing the nature and the arrangement of the strata. And then moving on to the ground model, which engineering geologists will be familiar with. The ground model is where we take our engineering structure and put it on top of the geology and the relevant geotechnical conditions. And geotechnical engineers will do this for all sorts of problems: tunnels, foundation design, sustainable drainage, mining, etc. So let's just look at a ground model. What do our friends in the engineering geology realm do? They usually produce some kind of picture. So this is just a picture talking about landslide hazards, and it's got all the key features relating to the landslide process, and in particular, because water is important for the landslide process, we've got arrows sort of highlighting water movement. This is a different ground model. It shows us the geology, as we'd expect. It also puts the project on top of the geology. So there's a parallel there with conceptual models. In this case, it's ground loading. And a couple of things that we don't always see in our conceptual models, but it's nicely shown in this ground model: uncertainties. In this case, the person creating it was unsure how thick the weathered granite was. They were unsure about the depth and shape of the unconformity, and they tracked that information. Similarly, they had to make some assumptions. So they were assuming the Holocene sediments were lying unconformably over the weathered granite. It's probably pretty reasonable, but they brought it out in their ground model, and I think many conceptual models can learn from that approach. Okay, so let's go to our own world, conceptual site models, and it won't surprise you to know that, in my view, a conceptual model should be showing us the relationships between the key factors, and in the world of contaminated land, those key factors are: have we got any sources, have we got any pathways, have we got any receptors? They should be showing us the main features of the process and the nature and arrangement of the strata. And we're talking now conceptual site models. We're not talking general. We want our conceptual model to relate to our site. So it might be, I think it's useful to think of the conceptual site model as simply an engineering geological ground model, but applied to the realm of contaminated land management. So is the conceptual model a table? Very occasionally, a simple table might capture the problem. So let's take the simple and quite well-known problem of there being high arsenic in the Northamptonshire sand formation. On my right, you can see the geology, and on my left, we've got arsenic concentrations. And the red simply means high arsenic. And so there's a strong correlation between high arsenic and the Northamptonshire sand formation. I would say that a table would probably capture that problem with a little information on the site history saying there was no evidence of any other sources of contamination. Our geology is simply topsoil over Northamptonshire ironstone. A simple table captures the source, pathway, receptor relationships. And the only uncertainty is actually what concentration of arsenic is there. But tables are often not enough. They are often incomplete. There's all sorts of assumptions that the person creating the table will have had when they were creating the table, but they don't record them. So for somebody else, the regulator, someone asked to review the report, it's difficult to check. And when I've seen a table with lots and lots of linkages, you sometimes lose the will to live to check it as well. The reviewer needs to look elsewhere to try and understand what is going on. And sometimes even the linkages aren't that well presented. So what I mean by that is you sometimes get a table where the person was clearly trying to do their thinking in the table. In my view, they should have done their thinking on a diagram, captured their uncertainties. The details don't matter, but if they'd captured their uncertainties, we could have had a much simpler table, which meant that people reading the table could have understood what was going on. So what about, is a cross-section enough for a conceptual site model? Because I do see many reports where we have a nice cross-section. I would say sometimes, but I like to see a plan view too, because contamination does vary spatially across the site, and also a cross-section with lots of arrows on won't necessarily enable the person reading it to understand the linkages. But let's take a look at a few. So these are conceptual models I found somewhere, sometime. I've picked on them and I'm commenting on them, and if they happen to be yours, come see me afterwards. So this one, I think this is quite a good one, because even though we've only got a cross-section, the pollutant linkage seems to me to be quite clear. We've got solvents migrating through the unsaturated zone, to the saturated zone, to the solvent, to the stream. I can understand that from the picture. Personally, I would have liked to say a spatial plot, because I would have liked to know how big that area was, but I don't really need a network diagram or a table because they've captured it. Now, this is a very nice picture. I bet somebody had a lot of fun doing that. Once again, I would have liked a plan view, but we've got a good idea of the geology, we've got a good idea of the sources, and we've separated them out. So you can see you've got some vapours, you've got some dissolved, you've got some napples, and I suspect that there's a bit of information sort of off picture, because we can see the 1A, 1B, and probably that's labelling the different pathways. So this is good, but I've only got part of it. This is another one. This one I find quite clear, and I know that there's a bit more information off site, these A, B, C, Ds, which would probably make it clearer still. But I got a pretty good impression very quickly. I've got these leaking tanks. It's going down into the water. That might get to the river, and those vapours might come up to the new houses. And I haven't read a word. I've just looked at the picture. Okay. So this one, I did finally find one where they had a plan view as well as a cross-section. And so we can see the features on our site. It would have been quite nice if they had put the extent of the plume on the plan view. I can see where the river is, I can see where the lagoon is, but I don't really know how big the contamination is spatially. That's my main comment on that one. Okay, this one I found a bit more trying. I probably could have worked it out if I'd read through it, but I have to say it is slightly overly schematic for my taste. It didn't have a plan view. The picture at the top was a site plan, and I think the red blob is supposed to be the extent of contamination, but it wasn't labelled very clearly, so you can overdo the cartoon nature of these pictures. So this is a table, the table that goes with it, and once again, this is the same table as we saw last time. They were doing a lot of thinking in that table. I'd have been a lot happier if we'd simplified it. And just a reminder, we are geologists. Geology isn't usually horizontal with hard boundaries. Usually it's got some kind of structure. The top of the chalk, anyone who's been to the North and South Downs, you know it's not horizontal. It's got hills, and it's probably got some solution hollows, so let's see that. Okay, so what does the guidance say? The guidance, let's look at CLR 11. The guidance says we should have a conceptual model. It should show the relationships between our sources pathways and receptors, and it should support the identification and assessment of pollutant linkages. Support, so that's talking about it as a tool, something to help us. It can be presented in diagrammatic or written form. As you know, I like a picture, but the written form is an option. It provides a systematic indication of what risks may result. And when we look at how the conceptual model drives the risk assessment, that you'll see that that is a systematic approach. And it enables uncertainties to be identified. R&D publication 66, published by DEFRA, the Environment Agency, in 2008. They give us a very nice conceptual model. They've done it as a 3D block diagram. Even better if you have the software for drawing that. We've got a good idea of what's going on that site. And they emphasise the importance, getting the conceptual model right and demonstrating understanding of all potential pollutant linkages is crucial. The format of the CSM should reflect the complexity of the site, and inadequate understanding of the conceptual site model will inevitably give rise to errors. And just about any bit of guidance that you pick up will talk about the importance of the conceptual model. So the Environment Agency's verification guidance says the conceptual model is a means to capture the boundaries of our knowledge. And I think that's very useful because as we write down what we know about the conceptual model, it helps us understand what we don't know. BS 10175. The process of investigation is characterised as one that seeks to reduce the uncertainty in a conceptual model. Well, if you're going to reduce the uncertainty in a conceptual model, you must have had some uncertainty identified there in the first place. Okay, so let's talk about how conceptual models drive the risk assessment. And it all comes down to capturing the uncertainties. I'm reminding you at the top how the person who created the ground model captured their uncertainties. We should do that in our conceptual models. And that could be anything. It could be the prior information. Did they actually bury animal carcasses on site? It might be geological. How thick is the made ground? How deep is it to the water table? It might be the nature of the contamination. Did the tank actually leak? Do we actually have contamination in the made ground? What contamination is there, etc. And this quote comes from Mr. Glossop in 1968. He was talking about geotechnical site investigations. If you do not know what you should be looking for in a site investigation, you're not likely to find much of value. And I think that stands for today. So Claire mentioned how some site investigations do not investigate what was mentioned in the death study. Perhaps that's because at the end of the death study, it wasn't nicely, clearly collected together what we didn't know. So the idea is you use your uncertainties to design your site investigation. You capture what is known in your picture, in your network diagram. You clearly list your uncertainties, and you use those uncertainties to become the objectives of the next phase. So it could be quite simply, if we've got an uncertainty whether soil contamination is present beneath the tank, our objective might be investigate for the presence, extent and depth of contamination beneath the tank. Or if our uncertainty is whether there's a risk to the river from contamination in the groundwater, could be our objective might be carry out a controlled waters risk assessment to investigate whether contamination is likely to present an unacceptable risk to the river. The idea is that somebody looking back at a sequence of conceptual models can understand what was the problem, what we didn't understand, what we then did, what we then found, what our next set of pollutant linkages are, and it goes on. And then when it comes to remediation, we should be able to use our conceptual model to help us design our remediation. So if we've, say, got a pathway from soil contamination to the future residents, then our remediation objective would be breaking that pathway. Or if we've got groundwater contamination migrating to the river, our remediation objective might be use a permeable reactive barrier to prevent migration of contamination to the river. And we can then, having clearly knowing what our remediation is supposed to do, design our verification to check that. So in this particular example, we've got some contamination going towards the river. We're proposing to put in a permeable reactive barrier to stop the contamination getting there, and our verification may well focus on testing the groundwater downstream of the permeable reactive barrier to check on contaminant concentrations. So effectively, the uncertainties of one phase become the objectives of the next phase, and it's an ongoing process. So let's just consider the conceptual site models at different stages of the risk assessment process. At phase 1, we're simply outlining the problem, and at phase 2, we expect to be able to add more detail. And I quite often see reports where we do actually have quite a nice phase 1 conceptual model, and then it just gets repeated in all the subsequent reports. When we get some phase 2 results, we'd like to see a phase 2 conceptual model, and then phase 3, we want to know either how the remediation will address the pollutant linkages or how it has addressed it. So in this example, petrol station, fairly familiar problem. We've got petrol station and we've got repair garage. We've got, it's going to be redeveloped for housing. And in the first stages, maybe we don't know too much about the geology. Maybe it's not too unreasonable to make it sub-horizontal. We don't know whether that contamination is actually there or not, but we know it could be. We've outlined our problem. At phase 2, we've done some boreholes. We know, we've got an idea about where our contamination plume is. Very helpful if we put that on the plan view. And if we improve our geological understanding, maybe there's a fault, maybe things are dipping, maybe we actually know quite a bit more about the contamination. We might be able to, for example, distinguish between a dissolved phase, a floating layer, and a vapor phase. And we can update our network diagram. And then at phase 3, we can show the remediation on the conceptual site model. So this is could be some sort of in situ remediation to clean up that groundwater. Could be chemical oxidation, perhaps something like that. And this is where I think the conceptual model is really powerful when you're thinking about your remediation. Obviously, what chemical oxidation or the in situ technique is going to do is clean up the soil and groundwater of things that are susceptible to that technique, like petrol and diesel. But what about the metals? This particular technique hasn't dealt with the metals. Now, that might be because the metals are no longer a problem, in which case they wouldn't still be on here. But it might just be the person got so involved with their chemical oxidation, they forgot to mention what they were going to do about the metal contamination. So I'd like to stress the value of thinking of the conceptual site model as a tool and not just as an output. And taking you into the realms of people who study how we process information, I just want to talk about what Alan Newell and Herbert Simon have said about memory. We can actually only keep a relatively small amount of information, about 4 to 7 pieces of information in our short-term memory. And that's why anybody who's grappled with lots of borehole logs and contamination results and sworn at the person who did the report because they haven't presented it in a way that's easier to understand gets brainache. So they talk about using diagrams and sketches as a kind of external memory. And I think that is a useful way to think about the conceptual model, trapping what it is we we already know and don't know. And we have to think about lots of things, the geology, the contamination, what media is our contamination in. We're trying to think in 3 dimensions, and some things change over time. And what are the pollutant linkages on this site, or what could they be, and how acceptable is the risk? So we've got tons to think about. So we would be very much helped to track the key facts in the conceptual model. So, as I say, my conclusions are we should think of the conceptual model as a tool, not just as an output. It's a means to capture what we know about the site, to draw together the relevant features that we know about the site for each phase of the work. And we can think about it as an external memory. We can use it to help us answer questions. Where shall I sample? What shall I test for? And to interpret the results. To think about what remediation is needed, and to think about what are suitable tests to show whether the remediation has worked. It's also a tool for discussion. We've got, and that can be within our own organisation, we've got finally all the information, or the relevant information about a site in one place, and we can start to think about, well, what are the pollutant linkages? Are there some that we can discount? And if we're not sure, and we often aren't, what else do we need to know in order to be able to decide? It enables us to capture our uncertainties, and as I've shown, it's those uncertainties that drive the risk assessment. And it's a means of communication to the regulator, to the public, to the reviewer, and an awful lot of reports that we write are then peer-reviewed by someone else in our industry, just as clever, just as diligent, and perhaps more clever and more diligent than us. So let's give them something that ticks all their boxes. And it helps us to anchor our conclusions in the facts. And I'll just leave you with this little cartoon to remind us about anchoring our conclusions in facts. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Next speaker is Sarah Mortimer from the Environmental Protection Group.
There's a black button on here, which I mustn't press because everything will go wrong. So, but I'm probably going to press it, so hold on tight, guys. So thank you very much for asking me to come and speak. I work at the Environmental Protection Group, which you probably haven't heard of, but you've probably heard of my boss, Steve Wilson. He's quite a character. You have to be a character to work at EPG, and you certainly have to have a sense of humour. I'm going to be talking to you today about ground gas and how we're hopefully moving forward with site investigation, monitoring and risk assessment techniques. Claire, Judith and I didn't sit in a pub and come up with the presentations together, but I think I worked out that between us we've probably got about 80 years experience. I don't contribute much of that, obviously. And what I find really interesting is there are some really strong themes coming through all 3 presentations. So it just goes to show how consistent our views are. What we're going to cover in the next 30 minutes is I'm just going to give you a brief overview of UK guidance, multiple lines of evidence, and I think it's really easy to look at gas and not use multiple lines of evidence. And at EPG, we are massive advocates of multiple lines of evidence, and by the time I finish this presentation, you'll be fed up of hearing that term. But I'm going to give you some examples of how we can use different lines to investigate gas risk. And then what I want to touch on is just how things are moving forward, hopefully, as we assess sources, as we assess pathways, as we monitor our sites, and as we choose what mitigation options we select. And throughout my presentation, you will see these little pair of glasses, these are watch points. These are things where I see things, or at EPG we see things going wrong pretty regularly. So these are just heads up, chaps, let's keep this bit tight. So UK guidance, we're very lucky in the UK. We have a plethora of guidance. And it's all available, well, there's links to everything on the Clair wall. These are the most recent guidance documents that we've had published since 2007. On that Clair wall is a load of the old Syria documents which were published in the 1990s. So Syria 149, Syria 150, Syria 152 and 130 immediately spring to mind. I have a real issue that some of the guidance documents that are getting published at the moment are not actually that informative. And Steve would shoot me down because he's wrote a lot of them. But if you go back to those really early guidance documents, they contain a wealth of information. Just read Syria 130, read Syria 152. You know, if you want to understand ground gas, they are the best resources available to you. So don't overlook those older guidance documents because not a lot has moved forward. And to demonstrate that, I'd like to take you back 18 years ago. I was in my last year at university, and Steve had slightly more hair on his head and was working with Jeff Card at Card Geotechnics Limited. And together, Jeff and Steve authored a paper, Reliability and Risk in Gas Protection Design. And ultimately, this paper culminated in this table. So this table's 18 years ago, but you probably recognise it because it has changed very, very little to what you have now got in BS 8485 2015. It may shock you to realise that this table is not based on any quantitative mathematical risk modelling. It is based on Steve and Jeff sat in a pub in Guildford and coming up with some numbers based on their experience. It is empirical. If you were sat there doing your risk assessments and your maths and you're arguing with what numbers you should be putting in, remember that the numbers that you are screening against when you are using in this table came from a conversation in a pub. It's true. What I would like to stress is footnote 3 and 4, because they're the most important things about this table. Know your source. If you do not know the source of your gas, how can you do a gas risk assessment? And investigate your gas. This guidance document's been somewhat overtaken by more recent publications, but still, site investigation remains critical to gas risk assessment. And as I say, what did it end up with? Well, you saw on the previous table, sorry, let me just go back, that we had this rather long-winded limiting borehole, what is it? Gas volume flow. It's effectively the gas screening value, the GSV, what you're comfortable now with because you see it in BS 8485. And the gas screening value is just borehole flow rate multiplied by gas concentration. And one thing I'd like you guys to question yourself is, does that equation seriously make a gas risk assessment? And just because you can do that equation, does that make you a gas risk assessor? Because when you look at BS 8485, the actual definition of using that gas screening value is not to take one number and multiply it by another, but it includes those final words that are written in green, to take account of all other influencing factors in accordance with a conceptual site model. And footnote 2 is critical because it requires you to use your professional judgment. And this is where I'd like to bring in the concept of multiple lines of evidence. Because again, I believe as an industry, we rely far too heavily on gas monitoring data. In fact, that can sometimes be the only thing that we consider when we're looking at gas risk. Now, this is a little figure I put together. I'm quite proud of that, actually, because I'm not very IT literate. But these are things that when I'm doing a gas risk assessment, I might consider 6 of those. I might consider all of those. And all those information data sources are feeding into my conceptual site model. The ones that are green are things that I'm going to go on to talk to you about. But collectively, I am using all the data from all those elements to inform my assessment of gas risk. I am not just taking the concentration that I've recorded and the flow rate and multiplying the two together and assuming that that gives me the gas risk. I didn't have to go far back. This was my site that I did last week, where I was working for the lady that owns this house. But this really picks up strongly on some of the things that Judith has been talking to you about. I would like to say, if you cannot draw your conceptual site model, how well do you understand your site? When I sit down with Steve to go through a report that I've been working on, if I can't draw him the conceptual site model, he will just send me home and tell me to go away and sort it out, because it's so important to graphically present your information. I was given a report by quite a large consultancy, and it wasn't a bad report. It wasn't a bad report at all. But the site was a timber yard, and it had got a bit of potential for vapour phase contamination, and it had also got some coal workings underneath it. And the consultant had got blinded. They couldn't see beyond the fact that you needed to go away and do some gas monitoring. There was no gas monitoring data. You know, go away and do your gas monitoring. But actually, when you sat down and you put the individual lines of evidence together, there was a lot of information for this site. Yes, there was some uncertainty that had to be resolved with regard to the timber yard, but we knew that there were no coal workings, and what little broken ground they had found, which was possibly just weak shale, had already been grouted regardless. There was actually very minimal made ground, and beneath that it was predominantly clayey. So if there was any contamination from the timber yard, it had probably actually not travelled that far. And we also knew, and this is a real bugbear, consultants not taking into account engineering construction of buildings. We knew that this particular residential house had been actually built with a proper RAF foundation. You know, it's a very thick floor slab construction, heavily reinforced with a very thick 450mm edge beam, which had actually resulted in the vast majority of mid ground being removed. So when you considered it holistically, you could see that actually risks associated with gas and most likely with vapour, although some uncertainty remained, could be conceptually addressed. Okay, so what I said I'd do is, although we are still using concepts like Wilson and Card from 18 years ago, I would like to think that we are moving forward as an industry. And one of the things that I would like to some of the things I'd like to talk about are some of the things that I think EPG are driving forward. So the problem, I think we're all used to seeing descriptions like the one on the left. I didn't have to travel very far. And the problem with those descriptions is they actually tell you nothing about that material as a specific gas source. They don't tell you really how much gas generation that source has. So to try and address this problem, EPG have recently authored a paper, The Logging of Anthropogenic Soils, a practical framework for application in the field. And the aim of this document is to develop a consistent, I can never say this word, I don't even know why I put it in my presentation, you can see it up there, that word. So that everybody, it doesn't matter whether you work for Card Geotechnics or Leap Environmental or AREPS, everybody is trying to get to the same endpoint when it comes to the logging of anthropogenic material. And within the paper, we've got this little flow chart. So we're quite clear that where you should use it. You shouldn't be logging rocks or normal soils in accordance with this framework. But hopefully, it would give practitioners in the field a guide to use when logging made ground, which is defined as uncontrolled fill. So things that have basically been placed by man. I'm a very simple kind of person, and what I really hope is that the last page of this document, you can print it out in your consultants, you can take it to the field, laminated possibly, and use it. And you might choose not to use it, but if you did, this is the general process that you would be taken through on the journey. So does the material comprise made ground? Because it should only be used for made ground. And then if it does, one of the most important things to consider is the material matrix dominated, or is it anthropogenic content dominated? Because these things are really, really important, because it's no good just to say industrial waste, plastics, metal and wood, I think it's very rare to dig actually into a waste mass and find that. More often than not, the waste will be maturated to some degree, and the matrix and understanding the matrix composition is incredibly important, because that's where the gas risk is most likely going to be. So describing the soil matrix, and then describing the anthropogenic content, and providing a visual estimate of that content. Now, I can appreciate that this is going to be perhaps, consultants will shy away from this. We're just talking approximate. You know, I'm not talking about whether you think it's 21.5%, but, you know, consultants who write newspapers or newspaper, well, quite often there might only be one newspaper, but understanding that can make a massive difference to understanding the gas risks that that material poses. Understanding if there's any oversized material. We're seeing a growth in industry at the moment with people considering landfill re-engineering, and to understand if we've got oversized material is incredibly important for those contractors. Documenting visual olfactory evidence, and then noting pit stability. Pit stability is really important. It's really important if you're going to do a large-scale remediation project, but it can tell you a lot about the waste and its strength. Noting any voided ground and logging all water seepages. And I think it's really important, you know, when we do site investigation, there'll be physical, geotechnical tests done on a lot of the material that we obtain. But for made ground, there might never be any physical tests done. And actually, all that will last after your trial pit has been backfilled is your log. And that can be really informed if we get some photographs. Now, I hope you're all sat there thinking this is nothing new, and it really, really shouldn't be. But what hopefully we will end up with at the end of the process is a description like that. And I'm a proper field engineer. I still like to get my hands dirty, and Steve insists on that at EPG. We go out to site regularly. And I'm not saying I'd want to stand in the field and write that out every time, but I do know that it's possible to write that out to that level of detail using shorthand. Pathways. So, what we regularly hear is piled foundations create preferential pathways for gas migration. Well, do they? You know, we want to, if that was true, that's fine. If it's not true, then we wanted to understand why and what the evidence for these decisions were. So again, Steve and I have recently published a paper which is going to be printed shortly into Environmental Geotechnics, which included extensive research and lots of modelling of piled foundations, and if indeed they do provide preferential pathways for gas migration. Our conclusions, just to give you a heads up, is that H piles and I piles can provide preferential pathways, but that the gas risk, the migration at piles increases, or the risk of migration from piles really increases where you've got pressure-driven gas sources, or whether you've got over-consolidated or thin layers of clay above those sources. But interestingly, the research that we've done and all the modelling that accompanies that research shows that where you've got a diffusive flow of gas, so such as a peat layer or an organic soil, and you used either driven or bored piles into that material, it's actually quite unlikely that the pile is going to provide a preferential pathway for gas migration, obviously assuming you've got a basic level of QA implemented during the construction. So this is a really good paper, and strongly advise that you try and get a copy. Moving forward, monitoring. We've got Ambisense, who Steve is also a director of those, so I will declare an interest in that as I stand here and talk to you. I don't really care whether you use Ambisense units or gas clam units. What I do care is that you use them on sites where they are necessary. In my 18 years career, I've used them twice. They are not going to be necessary on every site, but where you do use them, continuous monitoring, they can provide a very useful tool and an additional line of evidence for your site assessment. The Ambisense units can collect continuous flow rate data. I understand that the gas clam units, some of those can now. And you really have to think when you're using these, what am I trying to achieve? This is one of my sites up in Dumfries. Apparently there's no environmental engineers in Dumfries. They all live about 3 hours away. So it was much easier to put a continuous monitoring instrument into this site because I could sit in London and just dial in and look at the data. The client up here, a local authority client, wanted to understand if this is a landfill, and they wanted to understand if the flare, which was coming towards its end of its operational life and would be very expensive to replace, was actually having any influence at all on the gas regime both inside the landfill and outside the landfill. So on this specific site, where we were a long way from civilization, sorry if anybody lives in Dumfries, but we could use the continuous monitoring device to give us that data. So here it was appropriate, but don't believe everybody who tells you that they have to be on every site, because they're incredibly expensive, and that's the truth. Now, this is one of my little, Judith and I were together a couple of weeks ago, so she knows that this is one of my, I'm going to climb on the table in the morning to start ranting. Vapour intrusion. I believe that this is the elephant in the room that we are not talking about. Syria Report C748 was published in 2014, and I am pretty shocked it's not made a bigger impact on industry. And I believe that is because of membrane manufacturers. Be very careful when if you believe that you have got a site with potential vapour intrusion risks, be very careful when you are looking at membrane data sheets. Look for the term MDV, match manufacturer declared value. That will normally be alongside the permeation rate for a contaminant of concern. That number should be a laboratory number. It should be from a laboratory ISO test. Any number that's MDV is just a number that the membrane manufacturers decided to put on their data sheet. And if you are going to be specifying that membrane on the back of that number, I think you really do need to understand what it actually means. Consider asking membrane manufacturers for declarations of performance. So they are documents which sets out the material that your membrane is going to be manufactured from and what the permeation rates of those specific compounds are. We've got some membrane manufacturers that are refusing to release their permeation rate test data because they say that it's confidential. We have no allegiance to Juta, but I will say that Juta are leading the way at the moment. They have provided permeation rate test data for all the chlorinated solvents to us and all the volatile organic compounds that we are typically finding on our sites. And the difference that this permeation rate data makes is best demonstrated in a site where we also issued this report last week. This is a site in Epping where we've got chlorinated solvents beneath an existing building. The CLO is concerned about risk to existing residents. And there is no doubt in everybody's mind that we do need to get to a point where we're most likely going to be retrofitting a membrane. But which membrane to specify? Because I think we can all pick up a data sheet and those data sheets will say appropriate for use on hydrocarbon impacted sites, appropriate for use where you've got VOCs. How can those claims ever be made? How are those claims actually substantiated by the membrane manufacturers? You know, permeation, these compounds permeate through membranes. And the important thing is understanding that when breakthrough occurs, that rate of permeation and when breakthrough occurs. And that's the testing that we're asking membrane manufacturers to supply. And because Juta have supplied that data, we can use the J&E modelling, the modified Wilson and Card approach, to work out, because we know the concentrations in the subslab, we know the permeation rates through the membranes, and we know pretty much what the indoor ventilation is going to be within inside the residential dwelling to actually calculate the indoor air equilibrium concentration. And then we can justify our choice of membrane to the CLO. If you're not going through that process and you genuinely believe you've got a vapour intrusion risk, I'd strongly suggest that you read that Syria document that explains why it's so intrinsic to vapour risk assessment. So I'd just like to finish on some general watch points. We make lots of money out of these at EPG, so don't feel like you've got to correct them all. But If you, but I thought I'd be nice. I thought I'd give you some handy hints while I was here. CS1 sites that you are increasing to CS2 because your methane concentration exceeds 1% or your carbon dioxide concentration exceeds 5%. Just to be very clear, modified Wilson and Card does not say that you have to increase that designation. You don't have to put it up to CS2. You can keep it on CS1 if you can demonstrate through your conceptual site model that it is appropriate to do so. The number of times we see it was CS1, but we had carbon dioxide at 5.6%, so we've put it up to CS2. Do you really understand the implication of that on your clients? The cost associated with putting membrane and venting in where it's not required. The issue that by putting a membrane in, it's then probably got to be verified to some degree. And if the verification process doesn't quite go to plan, what the knock-on of that can be onto your clients. So be really careful when you're saying, we'll shove it up to CS2, doesn't matter. It really does have an impact. CS3 plus, so 4, 5, and red sites within residential development zones. I work on some of the worst gassing sites in this country and in Australia. I think I've probably had 3 CS sites that have been over CS3 in my career. If as consultants you're finding them every day of your professional careers, you probably need to be rethinking about how you're doing your gas risk assessments, because in reality they are quite rare. So, just a quick sanity check. It's CS4. Is it CS4? Sarah said that they don't come along very often. Is it definitely CS4? Let's go back to the conceptual site model. Let me interrogate all my lines of evidence. Let me make sure that my CSM for gas is absolutely spot on. Sites where active gas protection systems are being recommended. These should not be put in to unmanaged properties, so residential houses under the UK planning system. So if you're recommending these, just again, think very carefully, am I consistent with current UK guidance? If you're even going to put them into an industrial unit, here's the best thing that you can do, because these things have maintenance issues and maintaining them have massive cost implications. And also sites under Part 2A. We've sort of lost our temper with this a bit now. We keep on seeing consultants using modified Wilson and Card for assessing Part 2A sites. We are losing work to consultants who are using modified Wilson and Card to assess Part 2A sites for local authorities. I have explained to you that the numbers that are in Wilson and Card, Jeff and Steve came up with in a pub 18 years ago, and they have not changed. Modified Wilson and Card is a precautionary system for use in the planning process. It is not to be used for the assessment of SPOSH. Rant over. Okay, so my closing thoughts are that for gas risk assessment, we should always be looking at things that are credible. Judith picked up on this earlier. Conceptual site models that are overly complicated, where source pathway receptors, potential linkages are not ruled out and then taken out of the conceptual site model. Make sure your assessment of those pathways are credible and take those credible pathways forward. Talk about confidence. How much confidence have we got? When we're using a multiple lines of evidence approach, no single result should be definitive. All available results should be assessed together to determine if the pathway is complete. There should be uncertainty. There always will be uncertainty. Having uncertainty isn't an issue as long as you've highlighted it and you've decided where that uncertainty is ultimately altering the risk, or if that uncertainty really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And then when you're discussing all those things, credibility, confidence and uncertainty, be transparent. I am not a clever engineer, but I tell a really good story. My reports write well, my reports read well, and they are transparent, and that's why regulators enjoy them. And thank you very much for your time.
Sarah, do you want to stay on the questions? And if Claire and Judith come up, you can sit down. Stand up. have some questions before the first coffee break. When you ask your question, if you say which person the question's for before you ask the question, that would be good. So does anyone have any questions?
We've stunned them into silence.
Okay, there's one over there. Okay.
Can I just shout?
Yes.
Okay. Peter Dunbar. Question's probably for Judith, but I'm sure everybody else could join in. You indicated the shale gas model, the absurd scale of the conceptual model. How important is scale in conceptual models? And I'll just throw that in as I think it's the hydrogeological risk assessment guidance does require the conceptual models to be to scale. And certainly, anyway, you tell me what you...
Oh, okay, so I think the further you get into the process, the more scale is important. So when you're talking in general terms, sort of at the phase 1 and maybe in an early phase 2, the scale's not so critical because we're trying to get an idea of what's going on. But when we've got lots more information and we know where the permeable zones or whatever it is, then it's more important. I would say if it's important to understand the scale in order to understand the problem, then put some scale in your conceptual model. It's a case of what am I trying to show?
Any other questions?
Nicky Benitzi, Calbrain. My question is to Clair Dickinson. So, what determines the asbestos in soils laboratory testing regime, whether it's satisfactory or unsatisfactory? You mentioned 35% constitutes currently unsatisfactory.
Yeah. So the HSL run a proficiency scheme. So they actually look at both the qualitative or the identity bit, if you like, and the quantification. And it's the quantification where they're looking at Z scores, and actually you can go online and find this report and you can actually see, and I didn't put it on there because I couldn't get into too much detail, but it actually was spiking a soil, and Hazel is in the audience who does these tests, so she'll know probably even more about them than I do. But essentially the lab is sent a sample, they analyse it, it's spiked with so much asbestos, in this case it was fibres. They detected them, they submitted the results, and they compared them against Z scores, and there was significant variation. I don't know whether, Hazel, you want to add anything there?
Yes, it is improving. When they started that proficiency testing scheme, the range was enormous, but it's becoming better as the labs are becoming more proficient with the method. So it is improving, and asbestos is never going to be an analyte that you're going to get a really tight data set on. It's always going to be a very big spread just because of the nature of it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. There's a question there.
Hi, Mike Summersgill, geotechnical engineer. In my longer career than Sarah's, it's always been the case that we never spend enough money on site investigations, and there's been numerous civil engineer reports about spending more on site investigations, giving you more amenable cost outcomes to projects. It's blatantly obvious in contaminated land that we need more and more investigation data, and it often produces better results for clients, especially in gas measurement. What can we do as professionals to encourage clients to spend more, and maybe 2 stages of investigation, which is sort of a hopeful thing?
Well, I have some answers to that. The first thing is don't refuse to do work for people who won't pay you properly. That's my number one. The second thing is, and I know that's not always easy for everybody, but I do think as an industry we actually need to stand up for ourselves a bit more. Secondly, I think it's very helpful to have some kind of sampling strategy which justifies why you're going to do this. And so if people say, right, well, this is too expensive, then you can say, okay, well, we could do it in stages, and we'll just do the soils first. We'll see what that is, and then bring on the groundwater or whatever it is afterwards. And it is difficult. Yes, I think this comes out of an ICE document. You always pay for a site investigation, whether you have it or not.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think you need to talk their language. They talk, you know, we need to be talking about risk. I think site investigation is seen as one number. I'll have one number SI, please. That's meaningless. It doesn't necessarily. I've been to meetings where the client has a site that looks like it's got measles. It's got so many holes. Yeah, actually, have they addressed the risks in the ground? No, they haven't. And you're faced with telling them they need more SI. I mean, we need to stop thinking it as a tick in the box. I need an SI, one number SI. And I think you've got to give them almost like the risk back. And to a certain extent, if you look at the UXO industry, I mean, early on, you used to find yourself, before Syria guidance was published, not really, their risk assessments weren't transparent, but they sort of left you with the risk, didn't they? And I think we probably need to do a bit more of that. You know, if they're not going to let you sort it out properly, well, actually, the risk is yours. And I think it's getting that across. And I think standing up for ourselves and our profession in the nicest possible way, but we're not doing it for no reason. But we have all got to be able to communicate in a way and a language that the people we're talking to understands. And I know that I tend to talk about things that are interesting. The client actually isn't interested in my technical scientific bit. He wants to know that he can build it on time, he can make money. So we need to be talking their language.
Can I just also say, because I have a real bee in my bonnet that Judy's heard this already, but when I was a graduate, I was regularly sent out to trial pit, and it's almost like the trial pitting exercise is a dying art, and the engineers who log trial pits are dying breeds. And the probe hole seems king at the moment. But Claire said earlier, the probe hole is tiny. You know, think about that. Think about the uncertainty that you introduce just by selecting to do probe holes instead of trial pits. And I get that you might not be able to get access for trial pitting, but actually to reduce that uncertainty, there may be a point when you have to say to your client, oh, you know what, we need to do some trial pits. And it's a false economy for both geotechnics and contaminated land not to do those trial pits. So I challenge you in the next 6 months, try to dig a trial pit.
Thanks. Any one there?
Sorry, I'm in the back here. Question back, please. With regards to sort of clarity in the CSMs, is there a slight danger of when you're conceptualising and putting down all those risks, of putting down so many, your actual professional judgment of what the really big drivers of risk are and get swamped in a sea of
Mediocrity.
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
I agree. There is that danger that conceptual models often end up looking like spaghetti. I think it's very helpful, but there's only so much you can say in half an hour. Personally, I like to do more than one conceptual model for a site. So I'd have a gas risk assessment, I'd have a controlled waters risk assessment, I'd have a human health risk assessment conceptual model, because then you are focusing, you're only having to put on the bits that are relevant to that issue.
And keep them credible. You know, it's all about what is actually viable. There's no point chucking absolutely everything you've got at a CSM. Keep it, you know, credible to your site.
Thanks. I think we have time for one or two more. There's one at the back.
Yeah, and Mike Ribbett, Ground Extra. So it's a question really on conceptual models. It'd be nice to see a lot more process-based conceptual models, because really it's about migration, and migration is really influenced by processes. And it, you know, I'd like to see like a zoomed-in bubble on what are the key processes, you know, controlling that risk. And you know, you don't really see that in conceptual models, the ones you illustrated there.
That's true.
Can I perhaps direct you to a contaminated sediments model? If you go to the DEFRA research report, which they slid out recently on their website with no notice to anyone, no announcement, but if you go and look at that, there is a wonderful looking at all the processes, because of course, you know, there is a sediment process going on all the time, you've just then got to try and determine which of these sediments are contaminated and how that is moving. And if you really want to look at a process-based one, that is quite interesting.
I think my thoughts on that, all reports should be pointing towards those sort of more scientific-based models which are out there.
Point taken.
I think you're absolutely true, because specifically with vapour risk, the actual diffusion is governed by the actual properties of the soil, and it's absolutely critical when considering vapour intrusion flow that it is a process-driven CSM.
Thanks. Any last questions then before we break for coffee? No? Okay then. So we'll go for coffee in the library before the next speakers. Thank you to the first 3 keynote speakers. It was all really interesting. Our sponsors, who you can see on the board, Ambersense, Landmark and Kelp Remediation. We have a couple of stands from them and banners up as well, so go and chat to them. They'll be around all day. So yeah, time for coffee. So we have given the opportunity to a number of early career professionals to give presentations and talks themselves. So would you welcome the first person, Melanie Wright, to the stage?
Okay, thank you, Catherine. So as Catherine said, I'm Melanie Wright from Jacobs. I'm going to be speaking about our investigation of the Harwell Liquid Effluent Treatment Plant, or LETP. I'm just going to talk through a brief introduction to the project, a bit about the history of the site, the work we've undertaken, a bit about the investigation techniques we used. This is really focusing on what's innovative and different about this site investigation compared to an ordinary ground investigation, a bit about laboratory sampling, and then some health and safety considerations, again specific to this type of project. So the Harwell site is located here in Oxfordshire. The Harwell site itself is a former nuclear research site which is currently undergoing decommissioning. Our project is based at the liquid effluent treatment plant, located to the north of the main Harwell site. The overall aim of this project is to remove all structures and contaminated ground from the site to enable nuclear delicensing and the ultimate release of land for redevelopment. So this just shows a basic aerial photograph of the site, which shows some of the structures which we investigated and which will be ultimately removed as part of the decommissioning. So the LETP operated from 1948 till recently in 2014. The purpose of the site was to store and treat radioactive effluent from the main Harwell site. As you can see on the aerial photograph, the site is made up of complex infrastructure due to what the site was doing. It's made up of a series of above and below ground tanks which are being used to store and treat the radioactive effluent. The site also has varied radiological contamination. This is because it was treating waste from the Harwell site itself. The Harwell site, as I said on the previous slide, was a nuclear research site. I've heard some people refer to the site as one of the most radiologically complex sites in the UK in terms of the number of different radionuclides used, and therefore our site we were investigating has complex contamination. So first of all, the work we did started with a phase 1 death study. This was a really detailed 4-month death-based review of the historical records on the site. As part of this, we defined the conceptual site model for the site, and this confirmed the main land quality risks were radiological. It also identified where some of the highest levels of contamination might be expected for us to investigate. The 2 photographs on the slide, the top one is the site during early operation, showing some effluent either being dropped off or collected from the site. And then the bottom photograph is some of the tanks during operation in the 1950s. These are some of many which were reviewed as part of the death study. Just a really simple geological cross-section just to set the scene for what the site is like. So made ground at the surface with underlying head deposits, and then the bedrock is chalk, and then just some simple kind of schematics of where some of the tanks sit in the landscape which we investigated. So based on the death study information, the site was split into 26 zones with the different colours. Hopefully you can see that at the back. These zones were based on the different activities and processes happening in different areas of the site, indicating what types and levels of contamination we might expect from our ground investigation. Now, the cost of radioactive waste disposal is incredibly expensive, and therefore really detailed characterisation is really important. So As you can see on the plan, all the different coloured dots are investigation positions from our investigation. So we have drilled over 200 investigation positions to date. These are targeting made ground, natural ground, and underlying structures. As part of our investigation, we've collected samples and monitored throughout the investigation across the site. A key part of the investigation was to collect and compile radiological fingerprints. So this is the percentage of different radionuclides present in a sample, and this is going to be used during the remediation works. So I'm just going to briefly introduce some of the investigation techniques we used and then talk through some of the more innovative ones in a little bit more detail. So I'm sure most of you will have come across a lot of these in the field. So we undertook windowless sampling and concrete coring using a Terrier rig, often referred to as a window sampler in the industry. So we use this to concrete core into above ground structures such as building foundations, and then we windowless sampled at depth to retrieve cores of made and natural ground. We also undertook trial pitting, which you'll be pleased to know, I'm sure, in some of the large areas of soft standing. And we also used rotary drilling using a Pioneer rig to drill into some deeper structures. So one of the large aspects of this investigation involved coring in tanks. So as you saw from some of the previous aerial photographs, there's tanks all across the site, and we wanted to investigate within them. So one of the first considerations was how we were going to do this. So to use one of the large rigs I showed on the previous slide, that would be incredibly expensive. You'd have to crane it in, really quite impractical. So the best solution was to use a portable concrete corer. So you can see on both slides, this can be bolted to the floor and core into the base of a tank or into the wall and retrieve a wall core. So this was really successful to retrieve cores from the tanks. Another consideration within the tanks was the fact that it was very thick concrete. As you can see in the photograph, this is the driller retrieving some concrete cores. So in some of the tanks, the concrete was up to 1 metre thick, so we had to work out how to extract this. So the driller came up with the method to use a handheld drill to drill into each piece of concrete as it broke off, bolting onto it, and then either harnessing or lifting out by hand, depending on how deep it was. Another consideration in the tanks was the increased radiological risk. So as you can see in this photograph, the drillers are wearing full air hoods. This is filtering their air intake and reducing the risk of inhaling contamination. The drillers said to me the combination of the white Tyvek suits and the full face hoods reminded them what it would be like to drill on Mars. As well as drilling within tanks, we did a lot of above ground coring as well. A consideration with this was during the drilling process, you need to use water to keep the corer cool so it doesn't overheat. So we had to consider how to keep this contaminant or potential contamination contained. So a solution to this was to use these lamboons, which keeps all the water and particulate within our working area and prevents the spread of any potential contamination. Something else we wanted to do, as we showed on the previous slide, was to be able to drill into wall structures and retrieve whole concrete cores, such as this one. So the portable concrete corer is bolted onto the wall, and then cored through from front to back, and then a whole core is retrieved. This particular core was interesting. This is above ground wall, because the concrete was cast in 2 phases. So we retrieved a grey piece of concrete and then some brown with a gap in between. And we found the gap between the 2 pieces of concrete, found elevated radiological contamination, and we worked out that the gap between the 2 pieces of concrete had acted as a conduit for contamination. So by being able to monitor throughout the works and target samples such as this, we were able to retrieve all this information at this stage of our investigation. Another interesting technique was to try and target sample a buried underground tank. So I've just created a basic schematic to show this. So from the death study information, this structure was known to, or thought to have had, contaminated base and sides of the tank, have been infilled with clean material, which is the brown on the schematic, and then capped with clean concrete. So we wanted to be able to have a method to target sample, retrieve samples from each of these layers, and be able to monitor in the field. So to do this, we used the Pioneer rig, which is shown in the photograph. We drill vertically downwards, retrieving a sample from the base and the underlying chalk. And then we also drilled diagonally, which you can see in the photograph, so we could target sample and take a sample from the side wall of the tank. So the reason why we use this type of method was because we want to gain as much information from the ground investigation to characterise the extent and depths of contamination to provide information for the next stage of the work on site. Another technique we used was to try and locate a buried underground store, the location of which wasn't fully known. So the photograph on the slide shows the structure during early operation in the 1950s. This is the above ground part of the structure. This was then demolished, and then the below ground store part of the structure, the location wasn't fully known. So we used old engineering drawings, such as the one on the slide, with known features which are still present on the slide. We identified these features and then used our GIS mapping to then measure off of these structures to locate where things were. So this top part is a building foundation which is still present. And there's also some founding post which had above ground parts to the structure which are also present. So by measuring from these, we worked out where we thought the structure was located. We then used the terrier rig with the concrete coring attachment to drill into the structure. So the historical records also told us that the structure had a brick roof, had been capped with clean concrete, and then filled with some kind of concrete rubble. So this is what we were looking for. So I don't know how well you can see because it's quite dark, but this is the clean concrete we retrieved, part of the brick roof, and then the pots are the concrete rubble which we found underneath this. So by using this method, we were able to monitor all these samples and collect samples as part of our investigation. So I'm just going to briefly mention laboratory sampling. This is obviously a really important part of our works. So all samples from across the site were analysed for gamma spectrometry. Then with detailed radiochemical analyses on select samples. These are the full radiological fingerprints I mentioned on an earlier slide, which are going to be used during the remediation. And then from across the site, again, we had samples which were analysed for chemical tests. A large number of samples we collected were concrete cores from within the tanks and from building slabs. In a number of cases, the top surface of this was where the contamination was located, and therefore we wanted to find a way for the lab to cut these samples to prevent radionuclide dilution and make sure we were getting a really representative sample for what we wanted to show. So we agreed with the lab that they were able to cut our samples, so we marked them up on site, and then the lab produced these really detailed cutting plans showing exactly where they were taking the samples from, so we could be confident we were getting the representative samples we wanted. So now the next half of my talk is focusing on some of the health and safety considerations of this project. So first of all, the radiological risk. So we mitigated this with having full-time health physics monitoring. So we had our health physicist on site at all times. He monitored the ground surface in every single location before we started work, all arisings from the ground, and every single sample collected. So you can see in the photograph, this is him monitoring the ground surface of a tank before we started work. And then the other photograph shows him monitoring some samples which we've just collected. So he'll monitor all the samples at this stage after they've been collected, and again when they're packaged up before they're transported off-site. So in each location, we set up a safe working area using the barriers shown in my photograph. So the signage is denoting what the potential radiological and contamination risk is. And our health physicist then monitors the potential dose in the area, which he's doing in the photograph, and advises us on what type of personal protective equipment we need to wear. So in all areas, we wore the Tyvek suits, as you can see in the photographs, the usual hard hat, safety glasses, gloves. Then we're also wearing electronic personal dosimeters, which the little thing looks like an old pager, which is strapped to our waist, which is monitoring our received dose. And if we weren't wearing the full air hoods or a half face mask, we wore passive air samplers, which are the little yellow box at our waist, with the tube, which is monitoring our air intake. And then the barrier set up in our working area denotes when you're leaving the working area. So before we left the working area, we had our hands and feet monitored, and this prevents the potential spread of any contamination. Another consideration, health and safety-wise, was tank access, how we were going to safely access the tanks and be able to exit the tanks. So the best method was deemed to construct a scaffold staircase, which you can see in both photographs. We also then had to consider how the scaffolders would have a safe extraction method if they were having any issues during the scaffold construction. So the best method was deemed to use a davit system, which hopefully you can all see at the back. This is the orange arm in the photograph. So this works by the scaffolders wearing a harness, and then if they have any issues, they're then clipped onto the davit system. There's an operator permanently at the top, and then if they need to, then it works as a pulley system, and they can extract the scaffolder out and raise him to the top. So thankfully we didn't need this system during the works, but obviously really important to have these things considered and have these methods in place. Another consideration within the tanks was there was some residual sludge from the treatment process. So we needed to clear a safe working area, both from a radiological risk point of view and from a slippage hazard. So we had a safe working area cleared before we started work. Our health physicists then monitored the floor before we started, before beginning our drilling works. Then just a final health and safety consideration, often not thought about, but was the extremes in weather we had. So we conducted this investigation over the course of a year as a series of phases. So we started off in winter, so we had lovely trial pitting in the snow. We then had the consideration of ice within the tanks. Whoops, sorry, gone too far. You can see the bottom of that tank has been iced over. So we had to clear safe working areas within the tanks. We salted some of the staircases to reduce the slip hazard, all kind of things we don't often need to consider. And then we had the other extreme. One of the more recent phases was in June. We had a couple of really hot weeks. I don't know if people remember. It was well up into the 30s. So you can imagine wearing a full Tyvek suit with a face mask next to a drilling rig. It's incredibly hot. So we set up these gazebos to try and provide a bit of shade for our drillers and just make working conditions a little bit more comfortable. And then just a final point I wanted to mention was what our data has indicated about radionuclide mobility on site. So there's two aspects to this. So first of all, we just created a basic schematic. So some of the tank bases were brick, and we found localized contamination within the brick. We then found this preferentially traveled between the mortar of the bricks to the underlying concrete. Then the top surface of that concrete showed slight contamination, and then the deeper concrete then showed no contamination, and the underlying ground was clean from contamination, showing that the concrete was acting as a good barrier for the spread of contamination downwards. We also found made ground across the site showing localized contamination, but this stayed within the top half metre of ground and did not persist at depth, again showing that the radionuclides weren't that mobile on this site. This is quite different to other types of contamination you guys might have investigated, such as an oil spill, which maybe you'd expect more spread. So, just to conclude, our work was to successfully complete a complex and challenging ground investigation. Our data has provided a greater understanding of the nature and extent of contamination on site. The radiological and chemical data we've collected will help advise the remediation. A good example of this is during the remediation, each 1 metre cube bag of waste will be gamma spec'd. This will then be paired with the radiological fingerprints I've mentioned, which is the percentage of different radionuclides present in a sample to advise the waste disposal. Our information has also provided detailed information on below-ground structures, depths of concrete, where structures are located and the extent of them. And then overall, the data we've obtained will enable waste characterisation and hopefully help reduce the cost of waste disposal. And then just a final point, the other photograph on this slide is a mock-up of what the site might look like after it's been remediated. So quite a transformation from the first aerial photograph I showed you. Thank you very much for listening. Leave questions after the next session.